So the Big Muddy Speaker Series happens on the second Tuesday of just about every month. Although I think next month we might be taking a month off. We might take December off, but we'll see how it goes. And this has been happening for a little over 10 years. We have different presenters talk about different aspects of the Missouri River issues, history, culture, biology, ecology. And today is really cool because we're going to take kind of a virtual tour of some really awesome places along the Missouri River. And we'll get to that in a second. I do want to give a shout out to River Miles. Those are the folks that host the MR340 canoe kayak race. And they kicked in to pay for our webinar subscription for Zoom to make sure that the Big Muddy Speaker Series could keep happening. And it has happened all through this pandemic. So we've actually got recordings on the Missouri River Leaf YouTube station or channel of some really fantastic talks that have happened this year through the speaker series. If you have not been lucky enough to catch those, they are on YouTube, so you can watch them again. I'm Steve Shinar. I'm the Executive Director of Missouri River Leaf, and we are the host of Big Muddy Speaker Series. And just wanted to tell you a little bit about what we do. Our mission is connecting people to the Missouri River, preferably through direct action and experiences. And we do that through river cleanups, river education, and recreation. So all kinds of stuff. Obviously, this year's been a lot different. So if any of you guys were happened to tune in early, I was just running a slideshow of some of the stuff that we've been up to this year. And it was a lot, especially in the spring, just a lot of individuals out, doing cleanups in their neighborhood, their favorite stream. Pretty inspiring stuff. And honestly, fall, winter, spring, those are all really great times to run out and, grab some trash bags and clean up your local stream. We did just finish our last large Missouri River cleanup of the year at Cooper's Landing, and it was awesome. We had 99 volunteers that showed up over 3 days, and those folks removed 5 tons of trash. Actually, I think 5.5 tons of trash from the Missouri River in just 3 days. And a huge shout out to Bass Pro Shop, Columbia Rotary South, and Mid-Missouri Solid Waste Management District, who were our main sponsors for that event. Could not do it without that support. So right now we're entering the 3rd week of Watershed Expeditions from Home. So this is a program for students and families, really, to get together, do activities outdoors, explore their world, their neighborhood, their local streams, their watershed, and then get back together once a week with other kids to share what they learned and also do cool virtual field trips. It's an amazing program. And I'm sure we're going to continue doing that in some form or another next year. We're still kind of figuring out what next year looks like. And another exciting thing we should be launching pretty soon is a virtual river trip. And this is a film that local filmmaker Jim Karpowitz and Tom Newcomb put together, recording some of our staff out on the river, just showing some of the cool stuff on the Missouri River near us. So we're pretty excited. That's in partnership with Columbia Public Schools. So that should be coming out pretty soon. So look around for that. Now, the real reason you're here tonight is to learn about the cool natural areas along the Missouri River. And we're joined by someone who knows this stuff top to bottom. Mike Leahy is the coordinator of the Natural Areas Program for the Department of Conservation. And basically natural areas, he's going to tell you more about this and probably do a much better job than I am. But he's the Natural Areas Program basically has spent decades trying to find the premier cool locations around the state that really are the best examples of different ecotypes, different geological formations throughout the state. So what Mike has done is put together a presentation that brings together all those special natural areas that are located in the Missouri River Valley. And it really tells a story about what the Missouri River Valley used to be like. And also, you know, what is there now, which you can go see, which is fantastic.
Yeah, so thanks for the introduction, and thanks to all folks joining tonight and the work of Missouri River Relief. And we're going to take, like Steve said, a virtual tour of some of these natural gems along the Big Muddy. And to get us started, we're going to try to do a poll as kind of a natural history poll, just to get folks thinking about the neat natural history of our state, and in particular along our great river corridor. And so we have this poll, and I'm going to relaunch the polling here. We'll see if folks can get this now. So we've got just a multiple choice question, and I think you're able to vote on your end for those. We'll see how this works. This is kind of experimental for Steve and I. So which of the following are true? And the first question is, Missouri is home to more native plants than Alaska. Missouri is in the top 10 states for native fish species diversity. Shannon County has the most documented caves. The Ozarks were glaciated. Missouri's oldest rocks are 500 million years old. And I'll give folks a minute here to respond. And yeah, go ahead and vote for your answers. All right, we'll go ahead and end the polling. So let's see here. First question, Missouri is home to more native plant species than in Alaska, and that's true. Missouri has over 2,000, at least 2,000 native plant species, which is more than the whole state of Alaska. And second part, Missouri is in the top 10 states for fish species, and that's true too. We're number 9 in the nation with 200 different native fishes, ranging from giant blue catfish and alligator gar down to little minute darters in our state, including some species like Niagara darter that only occurs in Missouri and nowhere else in the world. Shannon County has the most documented caves. Well, that's actually false. Shannon County is, I think, number 2 or 3, but actually Perry County, Missouri, has the most caves in the state, which is something I have learned recently. The Ozarks were glaciated, and that's false. The Ozarks were actually never glaciated, which makes for their unique landforms and topography. And Missouri's oldest rocks are 500 million years old. Well, that's false as well. The oldest rocks are incredibly 1.5 billion years old, that form the core of our ancient mountains in Missouri, with the highest point in Missouri as well, Tomsock Mountain. So with that, I thought that was kind of a neat segue into our virtual tour of the natural gems along the Missouri River. And then this tour will take a look at the natural areas that are connected to the Big Muddy River Valley, and they range from floodplain wetlands to river bluff prairies and deep forests. And we're going to learn about kind of the fascinating natural heritage that occurs along this river corridor from the Iowa line to the Mississippi. And we'll look at the connections between native plants and animals, the soils, geology, and the human history in this really neat region that we live in. So starting off, the Missouri River is our continent's longest river, and it traverses a huge number of different ecosystems. Here in Missouri, that pattern holds as well, as the river cuts a really interesting course across the state from northwest to east. And as you see in this map with the relief of the state, you can see how it crosses through plains, as well as has a very entrenched valley in the lower Missouri River. And starting up in Iowa, then flowing down into the Ozarks, the river comes through the glaciated plains of North Missouri and then cuts into the Ozarks. And of course, those being two of our main ecological regions of the state, we have a great number of different species, and the river differs itself quite a bit, as well as its associated terrestrial communities from North Missouri down through the Ozarks of the lower Missouri. Now here in Missouri, ecologists with state and federal agencies, as well as nonprofit organizations and private individuals, have used the term natural communities to describe what we consider definable groups of native plants, animals, and their physical environments least negatively impacted by modern humans. And it's a way to classify our natural lands, kind of get our mind around, as humans, to try to pigeonhole the great diversity of life we have in the state. We have 15 main types of natural communities in the state, and as we take our tour through the river valley, we'll be visiting virtually some of these different community types. And each of these 15 major types can be characterized and subdivided by the geology and landform, the soils, the vegetation, the watershed characteristics. And so in a total, we have 85 different types of terrestrial and cave communities and 35 different types of aquatic communities here. Our main terrestrial communities include forests, woodlands, savannas, prairies, glades, wetlands, cliff and talus communities, and caves. And all of these different natural communities are actually found both within and along the bluff line of the Missouri River Valley across the state. We also, of course, have aquatic communities, ranging from our headwater creeks to creeks as we go downstream, to small rivers, large rivers, big rivers like our Big Muddy, and associated aquatic communities like oxbows and sloughs, and of course, freshwater springs, particularly in the Ozarks and our national scenic riverways, the Current and 11 Point rivers. Now, within each of these different aquatic, terrestrial, and cave communities occurs a wealth of different native plant and animal species. So we've already learned that, we have over 2,000 native plant species in the state, over 400 native bee species, at least 60 different reptile species, and like I said, close to 200 native fish species. And of course, these are the things that we know about. So many other groups of organisms like fungi and most of our invertebrates, most of our insect species and other invertebrates, we really don't know much about them at all. And we have many, many species that occur in this state that really haven't been documented. And so as conservationists, it's hard to manage on a species by species basis. Now, for some species that are high profile, so for example, pallid sturgeon, or a generalist species that's high profile like white-tailed deer, for those, we can actually get a grasp on that species biology. But for most of the other species in our state, we don't know enough about their life history to really manage for them on a species by species basis. And so what we do is we manage their habitats and natural communities. And to protect these natural communities, a long time ago, not that long ago actually, but in 1977, the Missouri Natural Areas Program was formed as a partnership between state parks and the Conservation Department, and then later the Forest Service, the Mark Twain National Forest, the Ozark National Scenic Riverways, the Nature Conservancy, and the Fish and Wildlife Service joined to identify and to protect and conserve these last remaining examples of our natural communities and geologic features. And then the logo of the program shown here is the jack in the pulpit, which you'll see on designated natural area signs. And we'll see some of these natural areas real soon as we take our tour across the state. But these natural areas on a statewide basis really abound with native diversity. And as you see here in the map, our natural areas are scattered across the state. However, there is a much larger concentration, as one would expect, in the lower Ozarks, which has had, a lot less intensive land use conversion over the past 200 years. So, for example, our natural areas support over 400 species of conservation concern, which amounts to 38% of all known occurrences of our rare or declining species. This includes 19 federally listed species and 34 state endangered species. So today we have 191 designated natural areas, and we'll talk more about where to find more information and visiting these sites later in the talk. And these areas cover 96,000 acres in our state, and over 90% of these are open to public visitation. So we'll start our talk up in the far northwest corner of Missouri in Atchison County, where the Missouri River enters our state from the Iowa line. And we'll start with Loess Hill prairies. So as you see in this slide, this is a Star School Hill prairie, which is extremely steep. You can see the Missouri River floodplain here in the background, and then you see these really steep hills covered by prairie grasses and forbs. And this is a great place to visit to get a super hill climbing workout, enjoy great views of the river floodplain, and then learn about prairie ecology and a unique prairie type. So prairies themselves are fire-adapted native grasslands that are dominated by warm season grasses, sedges, and perennial forbs with less than 10% tree cover. And the word prairie itself is a French word for meadow, and it was used by some of the early French explorers like Marquette and Joliet, who traveled up and down the Mississippi River corridor in the 17th century. Now, the Loess Hill prairies are a specific and unique kind of prairie. They range from Vermilion, South Dakota, all the way down to Mound City. And they basically are primarily on the east side bluffs of the Missouri River Valley. And they're very intricately associated with the Missouri River itself. They're typically on west and south facing slopes on the east side of the Missouri River Valley as the river valley kind of moves its way down from South Dakota down into Iowa and in Missouri. I said German because the term loess soil is a German term for windblown soil. So how did this soil get to this spot, and how did it get so deep as shown in this illustration? Well, it's very old. So over 100,000 years ago, the northern half of Missouri, shown here, lay under a glacial sheet of ice. And part of this ice sheet actually blocked the ancestral Missouri River Valley and created a huge glacial lake that started up in northern Missouri and then ran up into Iowa and Nebraska and even into South Dakota. When the ice finally melted as the climate changed and the lake drained, it left a vast plain of silts and fine sand. So think of sandbars and mud flats with all that sediment over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres. The climate then got dry and windy, and all that material was blown from the prevailing westerly winds eastward. And so we have a deposition of loess right away, first on those bluffs along the Missouri River, and then loess soils actually were blown all the way into the Ozarks. And they formed some of our more productive agricultural soils, but that's how that soil got there. And that's why we have the Loess Hill prairies. So these steep landforms, and you can just see these slopes are at an angle of 45% above the river valley, are dominated by native grasses, as you can see here, things like little blue stem and side oats grama, but they also support a number of species that are Great Plains species that are more common in central Kansas, central Nebraska. And they kind of are they are at their far eastern edge of their range here in Missouri. Some of these include things like the nine-anther dahlia, the painted murmia grasshopper, dotted blazing star, and soapweed, which is one of our native yuccas. Now, researchers with the University of Missouri, Mike Stambaugh and Rich Guyette, are dendrochronologists. So they look at tree cores and tree stumps to age ancient trees and also to record fire scars on those trees. And so they were able to find these ancient and really beautiful bur oaks at Brickyard Hill Loess Mound Natural Area, which also is in Atchison County. And they were able to age some of these trees back to 1671. And for those really old trees, they were able to determine for the pre-European American settlement period, which in that part of the world is about 1820, those trees were scarred by fire about every 7 years, which again indicates the importance of fire in maintaining our prairie ecosystems. And a colleague of mine, Steve Bubeck, was able to come across and find a picture from 1912, black and white picture of this area, which is astounding because we have so few pictures of our native prairie and savanna habitats from, the early 1900s. And this is an example of what those savannas, bur oak savannas and prairies looked like, with the prairie slope being here off to the this side of the man with the derby hat, and then grading into the savanna where the lady with the pith helmet is, I don't know if she's taking measurements or what, but anyways, this is what that area looked like, and what we're trying to restore on our Brickyard Hill Loess Mound natural area today. And you can see a real similar picture to that today, which is really interesting on this natural area. So Missouri has a rich prairie heritage. This map was compiled by MU geographer, retired now, Walter Schrader, shows that in 1800, at least a third, or 15 million acres of Missouri was in tallgrass prairie. And we know from different botanical and geologic studies that 15,000 years ago, when Wisconsin and Michigan and the lake states were under a sheet of ice, that the climate and vegetation in Missouri was more of a spruce fir forest, more like a Canadian woods than what we have here today. But then around 6,000 years ago, we know that the climate got warmer and drier than it is today. And that warmer, drier climate, in conjunction with Native American burning and lightning burning, allow the eastern tallgrass prairie to spread from the Great Plains as far east as Ohio. And so with that, since that time period, in the last few thousand years, our climate has become more mild, more wet. And with our current climate for the last few thousand years, we support trees more than grass in the absence of fire. And so really it was the work of Native Americans utilizing fire for a variety of different cultural purposes that helped to sustain our tallgrass prairies up until European settlement. And then since then, of course, the use of prairies for hay as well as grazing protected them up until the more recent period when we've been able to reinstate fire on some of our prairies on both public and private lands. Now we'll move downriver to Platte County, north of Kansas City area, and we'll visit Little Bean Marsh Natural Area. So marshes are wetland communities that are dominated by plants like cattails and bulrushes and smartweeds and mallows and sedges that are able to tolerate saturated soils and flooded conditions for lots of the growing season. They're adapted to wetlands. The term for a wetland adapted plant is a hydrophyte. And so in the Missouri River floodplain, our marshes were common in areas that were sloughs and old oxbow lakes. Unfortunately, few marshes remain, such as Little Bean Marsh, because of agricultural and industrial development. However, historically, the seasonal flooding provided by both the Missouri River as well as the feeder streams from the uplands into the floodplain, as well as groundwater from the floodplain itself, helped to sustain these marshes. And these marshes are really important for birds that today are considered rare and declining. And these include things like the least bittern, which is exquisitely designed or adapted, I should say, with its body form and its feather coloration to be a very well camouflaged in a cattail or a reed marsh. Other birds include the sora rail, and these birds both use our marshes for breeding and nesting as well as migration. And they're extremely important for these as well as other rails and bittern species. And our marshes provide habitat just for a wide variety of wildlife. This includes waterfowl such as mallards and a wide variety of other duck species, migrating shorebirds such as the solitary sandpiper here, which migrates through Missouri. Most of its breeding population is north of us, but it also spends its winters in the Gulf states as well as far south as Nicaragua and Central American countries. So it's one of those long distance migrant birds. Also wading birds like the great blue heron, muskrats, and just a wide diversity of amphibians, things like the southern leopard frog, the boreal chorus frog, and others. Swamp milkweed, which is one of our characteristic plants of our marshes, is a very important host plant for monarch caterpillars in terms of being a desirable host plant. And it's also the one of the sole food sources for the swamp milkweed leaf beetle, which feeds 90% of its diet on swamp milkweed, which just shows some of the intricate relationships between, in this case in particular, insects and plant species. There's a very often a lot of coevolution occurring within our insect and our plant species, which is really fascinating. So at Little Bean Marsh, some years ago, the U.S. Geological Survey did a study, and the scientists involved with that study were Dale Blevins and David Hyman, and they studied the hydrology and water chemistry of Little Bean Marsh. And the results indicated that the marsh is very effective in trapping phosphorus and nitrate, which contribute, of course, to the Gulf hypoxia issue in Louisiana and the Gulf. And they wrote in their report that based on their data, it indicated that the historically vast extent of riparian marshes along the Missouri and Mississippi rivers may have had a substantial role in limiting nitrate loads to the Gulf of Mexico before agricultural development of the floodplains. And of course, today with restoration of marshes through the Wetland Reserve Program, as well as things that the Conservation Department and Fish and Wildlife Service do, private landowner restorations, increasing that acreage of marshes in the floodplain will, to some degree, help trap some of the phosphorus and nitrate, which are coming off of agricultural fields, and help, to some degree, alleviate a small part, at least, of that Gulf hypoxia issue. Now, marshes in the floodplain of the Missouri River historically were just as dynamic as the river itself. So in this map here, we see the river in 1804, at which time Little Bean Marsh was part of the river channel itself. And then as the river moved across its floodplain through time, in this illustration, we see how the river was cut off and left at Oxbow Lake here. And then slowly that Oxbow Lake, called Bean Lake and Little Bean Lake, eventually resulted in the formation of Little Bean Marsh. And here's an aerial view today of Little Bean Marsh. The national area boundaries in red. Bean Lake is still here. It is slowly converting to a marsh over time. But one of the problems we have at Little Bean Marsh, as well as many marshes in the Missouri River floodplain, is that it's disconnected from the river itself by a series of levees, of course, that keep floodwaters from reaching the marsh. There's also a floodgate here that prevents water at high water levels from flooding, backwater flooding up into the marsh. And the marsh itself doesn't get as much water as it used to. So in 1914, when this topographic map here was made, we can see that Bean Lake and the marsh associated with it was fed by two stream systems. One was Short Creek and the other was Sugar Creek. Now today, Sugar Creek and its watershed don't flow down and doesn't flow down and sheet flow into Little Bean Marsh anymore. It's diverted directly to the Missouri River. So today, the marsh and adjacent Bean Lake being cut off from the river don't function exactly the same way they did 200 years ago. And the U.S. Geological Survey, again, Dave Hyman did this study for the Conservation Department, looking at the frequency of flooding at Little Bean Marsh in two different time periods. The first time period are the black bars here. This shows the duration of flooding per year and the number of floods per year. So, in what we call the historical period, where we have hydrological data on river levels, he found that there were, a little bit, somewhere between 1.5 and 2 floods per year at Little Bean Marsh, based on, and this would have been backwater flooding from the Missouri River. And these floods lasted on average 40 days per year. Now, then he took, at the time, current hydrologic data from 1970 to 2008, And he did two projections. One is what would have happened to Little Bee Marsh in terms of flooding if there were no levees on the river in this bend of the river, and found that there would have been 2.5 floods per year, but the duration of those floods would have been less. And this is shown in the red bar. And then, of course, the yellow bar shown here shows essentially the current regime for backwater flooding from the Missouri River on Little Bee Marsh. Very, very little influence in the current modern era on backwater flooding to provide the needed water for the marsh. So most of the water for the marsh comes from groundwater rising up into the marsh during flood periods, as well as some water from short creeks. And the marsh is not what it used to be in terms of its flood regime, but it still provides important wildlife habitat and ecosystem services. And this natural area is still a great place to visit in the spring to bird watch and in fall. And in the spring, it's even doubly greater because you can just go out onto this boardwalk, and at dusk you can just hear a great cacophony of amazing sounds of toads and frogs during their breeding season. And this area also features a really nice disabled accessible paved trail that leads out to two different marsh viewing areas, this being one of them. So moving down river a bit more past Kansas City and where the Kansas River enters our Missouri River floodplain, we see an aerial image here of the floodplain just north of Sibley, Missouri, and the historic Fort Osage site. And here we see two oxbow lakes. We see Cooley Lake as well as Jackass Bend. And both of these oxbows, of course, were formed from old river meanders. And this is how our marshes evolve did evolve in the river in the past. The river would meander across its floodplain, creating these oxbow lakes, and then it would abandon that channel, leaving an oxbow lake that eventually fills in and creates a marsh system like which we have at Cooley Lake. And eventually these marshes fill in with sediment over time and go from a marsh to a shrub swamp dominated by things like buttonbush and willow, and eventually a cottonwood sycamore forest. But the problem in today's river floodplain is places like Little Bee Marsh are not being created anymore because the river isn't flooding and scouring like it used to, as well as some of these Yazoo type rivers like the fishing river shown here have been diverted more directly to the Missouri River and don't meander across the floodplain like they used to. So for our marshes, we're in a bit of a quandary in terms of how to restore these and how to keep places like Little Bee Marsh functioning. This shows again the river oxbow lakes where our marshes develop. And the soils show a record, of course, if you look at the soil maps for the river floodplain, they show a record of the river's meandering and the formation and abandonment of oxbow lakes. And so this block diagram shows the different soils and where you would expect to find different natural communities. So the sandy alluvium that's formed in a river floodplain is typically on your natural levee and terraces. So that would include areas like this. And these are more loamy and sandy soils. And these areas historically were dominated by riverfront forests of cottonwood and sycamore. The old meander channels of the river included soils like the Loess soil, which were old oxbows where the clays and silts were dropped out of the river in those low water movement environments, backwater flooding. This is where your marshes and shrub swamps normally would have formed. And then on the higher terraces, back farther up, such as over here, you would find bottomland hardwoods dominated by things like bur oak, shellbark, hickory. So the soils really record a story of where the different natural communities occurred. And we use this information too when we restore different community types. So if we're going to restore a wetland community that's going to be a marsh based on soils, we're not going to want to try to do it on a Haney or a Sarpy soil. We're going to want to find a Leda soil or an appropriate soil. So the soils are very important in terms of guiding restoration and reconstruction efforts of our wetlands in the floodplain. So moving a bit farther downstream, now we're coming to Van Meter State Park. And as you can see here, the river floodplain gets extremely wide in the area vicinity of Grand Pass and Van Meter State Park. And here at Van Meter State Park, we have the Missouri Natural Area, which features both upland and bottomland forests, as well as a very significant marsh, which we see in the slide here. And this marsh is very unusual in that it's partially fed by calcareous groundwater that's seeping out from the hills, Loess Hills above it. And it creates neutral to even slightly alkaline water chemistry. So it creates what we call fen communities. And this fen zone, which is right at the base of the bluff as it enters into the marsh, supports some really interesting and unique species like the tufted loosestrife, which blooms in the spring. And this place is a great place to visit as well, because you don't have to get your feet wet. It has a nice boardwalk system so that you can explore the marsh at many different times of the year without having to, don hip waders or get yourself caught in knee or thigh deep marsh muck. Another interesting thing about Van Meter State Park is it has a Native American museum that documents the Native American cultures in Missouri, which is a fascinating museum. And the area itself was the tribal center for what we now are called the Missouri Native American culture, which based on archaeological evidence utilized this area from around 1300 to the early 1700s, right there at Van Meter State Park. And these people that called themselves, and I'm not sure on the pronunciation, the Noachi, spoke a language of the Siouan language family. Now, the French colonists called them the Missouri, and again, I'm butchering the French, and that roughly means people of the dugout canoes. And of course, these people would have been instrumental in both utilizing and shaping the prairie and marsh natural communities around them through their use of fire, as well as crop production and hunting. Unfortunately, European diseases devastated this tribe, and after warfare with other tribes in the area, the decimated Missouri dispersed to become members of other tribes, such as the Osage. However, the namesake of our river and our state are derived from this culture. And so it's important that we remember and recognize this, and these people are still here in our country today. So as we move downstream from Van Meter State Park and get to Glasgow, Missouri, the river makes this great bend and it enters the Ozarks. And so there it starts to cut down through dolomitic limestone, and the river valley changes dramatically from a very wide river valley, several miles across, to one, in some places less than a mile across, constrained by the geology, essentially. The bedrock geology to the west of Glasgow is sandstone and shale covered by glacial deposits. And so it's much easier for the river to cut through that, but then it hits the Ozark uplift, and that constrains the river valley because it has to go through the force of the water is just not enough to really erode the very strong rock of the Ozarks. The map on the right here is a historic reconstruction of the vegetation in this bend of the river in about 1800. And the green colors are areas that would have been wooded in 1800, and the grays are areas that would have been prairie. And the interesting thing about this map is that, especially if you zoomed out, you would find that there were expansive prairies in Cooper and Saline County, as well as Morgan and Montauk County on the western parts of these counties. And of course, in Saline County, the prairie extended almost all the way to the river floodplain. But on the other side of the river, we find a lot more forested communities, especially in Howard County. And it's thought that the river basically provided a fire break so that prairie fires from the west were slowed down once they hit the river and the dissected topography. And so that, in the absence of the river, Howard County would have likely been dominated by prairie vegetation historically rather than forest. So from here, we'll enter the lower Missouri River Valley, and we'll take a look at Schnabel Woods, Grand Bluffs, Weldon Spring Hollow, and Pelican Island natural areas. We'll start with Schnabel Woods, which is owned by the University of Missouri, is in southern Boone County. And this old growth forest can be accessed from the Katy Trail. And it can be accessed basically from land that is adjacent to Schnabel Woods that's owned by the Conservation Department. It includes a bike rack and trail that you can take up through the forest that parallels the natural area. And then you can look down at the natural area from the trail. And on top of the bluffs, you can view Eagle Bluffs Conservation Area from this trail and have a great view of the old growth forest. And so what ecologists define as true forests, like we see here, are dominated by trees that form a closed canopy at maturity and are interspersed with multiple layers of shade-tolerant subcanopy trees and shrubs, vines, ferns, and herbs. And the trees usually attain pretty good heights, ranging from 60 to over 100 feet tall. And the ground floor is rich in ferns and in spring ephemerals. And these forests occur in fire-protected landscape positions. So these are on lower slopes, usually adjacent to larger rivers on the east side, north and east facing slopes, areas that retain moisture and don't dry out very quickly. And so these forests are usually dominated by things like white and northern red oak, hickories, maples, and ash. And the understory is usually supports things like dogwood, pawpaw, and spice bush. Now, this type of forest is actually, on a statewide basis, not that common. A lot of our forests are more dry and rocky. And these are what technically we call woodland natural communities. And these form a lot of the what make up the wooded areas of the Ozarks. These are dry, rocky soils on dry, rocky ridgetops or southwest slopes. And they're usually dominated by things like chinkapin oak, black oak, and post oak, and sometimes shortleaf pine. And these communities, in contrast to our true forests, are fire-adapted communities. And as you see in this picture from Hahatonka State Park, when restored with prescribed fire and thinning, they support almost a prairie-like understory. And in this picture, you can also see these, short, stunted, less than 60 feet tall post oaks. So a lot of our forested communities in the Ozarks, especially on droughty soils, are what we would technically call woodlands, or more have a lot in common with prairies and savannas because of our area in Missouri that we're kind of in this transition zone between the prairies of the West and the eastern deciduous forest. So moving downriver, near Herman on the north side of the river lies Grand Bluffs Natural Area. And this is a great place to see fall color. It was like this not that long ago. The bluffs are up to 200 feet tall, and they're fluted bluffs. So they're not uniform. They're not like a quarry face. They've got nooks and crannies and stair steps and little spires that come out. And at the base of the bluffs is the Katy Trail, and then, of course, the floodplain. And fortunately for these bluffs, they were spared the blasting that occurred on many bluff systems when they were building the Katy Railroad. So this is a unique area where we have a significant bluff feature that was not impacted by the Katy the Katy Railroad's development, where many bluffs were blasted to provide fill for the railroad bed. Many of the eastern red cedars that you see growing on the bluff line here are at least 200 years old, and some are likely over 400 years old. And some, of course, are growing in tortuous conditions, growing out of the fissures of the rock and growing extremely slowly. Now, one interesting thing about the biology of red cedar is that when they are young, as seedlings or saplings, they are very susceptible to fire. And before the advent of wildland fire suppression in Missouri, circa around 1930, red cedars were pretty sparse on the landscape. In fact, the early land surveyors in the 1800s from the General Land Office survey found less than 1% of their trees that they used for section line bearing trees were eastern red cedar. And of course, today, eastern red cedar is ubiquitous on the landscape. And in that case, when these cedars are not growing on cliff edges, we kind of consider them invasive. They take over glades and prairies and old fields and can form a cedar monoculture, essentially. At Grand Bluffs, we find these narrow bands of exposed dolomite that form open glade communities with prairie grasses and pale purple coneflower. And the conservation department here has done some cedar thinning, and we conduct periodic prescribed burns to maintain these unique mini desert prairie communities. Also interesting, being as it is north of the Missouri River, it's one of the few places, among a few others, in the Missouri River Hills north of the river, where we find desert-like species, including the striped bark scorpion and even the tarantula. There's a few areas north of the Missouri River where the tarantula actually occurs, and this is one of them. Grand Bluffs is a great place to visit. There's a hiking trail that provides a great workout. It's about a 2-mile hike to the top. And once on top, there's a nice little overlook where you can see some of these glades, as well as get this great view both down and upstream of the Missouri River Valley there in the Herman area. And then, of course, below the trail is the Katy Trail. So you can combine a hiking visit with a biking visit as well. Next on our list, which also you can include a hiking and biking trip, is Weldon Spring Hollow Natural Area, which is in St. Charles County, and it's part of the Weldon Spring Conservation Area. This natural area features steep hills and bluffs and dissected terrain with Loess soil, remembering the Loess soil, which is much thinner here than on those Loess Hill prairies. However, it does provide good growing conditions for century-old and large girth northern red oaks, bitternut hickories, and maples. Pawpaw and spicebush are abundant in the understory. And this is a great place for birding in the spring, especially. It's a great migratory bird spot. And it also includes a number of warblers that both migrate through and nest here in the spring. And this includes things like Kentucky warbler, the American redstart, and Louisiana water thrush. Interesting thing about conserving these species is that we have to provide high quality forest habitat in large enough blocks here in Missouri for these birds to breed. They do suffer from cowbird nest parasitism. The cowbird is a native bird that was originally followed the bison herds out west, but then as we fragmented the landscape out east, they moved in, and they're what they call a brood parasite. So cowbirds will lay their eggs in the nests of these other bird species. And then the cowbird chicks are actually bigger and more aggressive than some of these bird species. And so they actually outcompete the fledglings of some of these what we call neotropical migrant songbirds. And so to cause declines in these species. And the more fragmented a landscape is by pastures and development, typically the higher the cowbird populations are. So that's one issue we have with these songbirds here on their breeding grounds. But then a lot of these birds migrate across the Gulf. They did this about a month ago and spend their winters in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, as well as all throughout Central America and even as far south as Venezuela and Peru. And so conserving these birds is a very tough challenge, because we have to conserve their habitat here in Missouri, as well as Central American countries, which can be difficult to do. But it has to be done at both ends of their life cycle. So that just poses one of these conservation challenges we have with our bird populations here in the state when they are migratory like that. The large down and dead wood trees, such as this really large down northern red oak here, provide very important habitat, especially during our hot and dry summers, sometimes for amphibian species, including the ringed salamander and the wood frog, which are both species of conservation concern. Wood frogs are unusual in that they are one of the species of frogs, along with the spring peeper, that actually produces a natural antifreeze in their blood in the wintertime. So they burrow underground, but they don't burrow far enough to get below the frost line like some other amphibians, such as toads, which means that they end up partially freezing during the wintertime, and they have a glucose substance in their bloodstream, which prevents their blood from freezing. And then in the spring, they will actually thaw out, but their core body functions don't become completely frozen, which is pretty fascinating. In fact, I saw a time-lapse photography video of wood frogs, like a frozen mass, actually thawing back out and coming kind of miraculously back to life from being near comatose in the wintertime. Just another one of these fascinating nature stories that we have. And this natural area is accessible from the Katy Trail, as well as off of, I forget the main road that goes there north of it. So it's got 2 access points, and it has a really nice Lewis and Clark hiking trail system, which provides up to 8 miles of hiking that goes through part of this natural area. And it features both hiking down through these really beautiful forested valleys, as well as some bluff top views of the river valley itself. And in the springtime, the forest floor at Weldon Spring, as well as Schnabel Woods, is blanketed with these spring ephemeral wildflowers shown here. And the seeds of these wildflowers are primarily dispersed by a number of different native ant species. Again, this really interesting relationship between plants and insects. So these seeds shown here of these different wildflowers, such as bloodroot or Dutchman's breeches, they have a little sweet treat, basically a protein-rich, fat, protein, and sweet appendage on their seeds, the technical term of which is an aleosome, that is attractive to these ants. So the ants gather up the seeds, they bring them back to their nest underground, they eat off the food part, the treat, and then they put the seed itself in their refuse pile, which ant colonies typically have. And what happens is that some of these seeds invariably will germinate. So the ant species are actually responsible for when you see a display of Dutchman's breeches or trout lily spread out across the forest floor in the spring, you can thank different ants for having created that dispersal. Unfortunately, for many of our river hills forests, the invasive bush honeysuckle, Linistra macchii, is an ongoing threat to these areas, and can, if left unchecked, it will eventually create these monocultures and completely shade out the understory, and then basically preclude the regeneration and reestablishment of our native oak species, as well as all the wildflowers and then the insects that depend upon them. So conservation department staff, as well as volunteers and others in a number of different places, are using an integrated control approach, using a combination of prescribed fire and targeted herbicide application and mechanical control, pulling seedlings out to keep the honeysuckle at bay. But it's a huge problem up and down the Missouri River corridor, including places like Weldon Spring Hollow Natural Area. Now, as we head towards the confluence in the river, we pass by St. Charles, shown here in this topographic map. And at the top of Fox Hill, which is now Fox Hill Park, in 1811, Henry Marie Brackenridge looked north across that floodplain, which now is mainly agricultural, but also includes Mary Tim Clare Conservation Area shown here. There's the Newtown development over here in the bottoms. But in 1811, he described this as such: "We behold the ocean or prairie with inlets with islets at intervals, the whole extent perfectly level, covered with long waving grass, and at every moment changing color from the shadows cast by the passing clouds. 100,000 acres of the finest land are under the eye at once." And it's kind of hard to fathom such a scene now in that same location, but it's another reminder of the prairie legacy in our state and of how the floodplain has changed through time. And a reminder too that the Missouri River floodplain was not all bottomland forest. It was a mix of different natural communities, including prairies and marshes and swamps. It was very much a mosaic of these different community types. So now we arrive at Pelican Island National Area, just 10 miles upstream from the confluence with the Mississippi. And Pelican Island is one of the few large non-accreted islands in the river, the Missouri River in Missouri, to have persisted in some form. And we know that Pelican Island was at one time a series of 3 islands that date back to 1878. And those islands today have merged, but they were all in about the same place as where the current Pelican Island is since the late 1800s. Today, Pelican Island is about 3.5 miles long at its longest and about a mile wide at its widest. And a map from 1958, aerial photo that we were able to find, shows that about half the island was forested then, and then the other half has grown back into riverfront forest since then. So it has supported original forest since the 50s. And the forests here are typical of many of the mature riverfront forests that folks who know the river valley are familiar with tall sycamores, silver maple, and cottonwood, with scattered hackberries, and soon to be declining, unfortunately, green ash, which is starting to decline because of the emerald ash borer, a non-native insect species. We have a variety of native grapes and poison ivy, which are abundant, as is, of course, the non-native invasive Japanese hops vine. These forested islands provide really good habitat, though, just like was mentioned earlier at Weldon Spring, for migrating songbirds, and of course, resident birds such as the pileated woodpecker and the red-headed woodpecker, which use this area all year round. And this natural area is kind of an adventure to get to. It can be accessed by boat, even just a kayak, because it's just a narrow channel between the mainland and the island from Sioux Passage, St. Louis County Park. And sometimes during very, very dry periods, there's actually a muddy way to get across that slough onto the island, but typically a boat is needed to access Pelican Island National Area. Now, unfortunately, today we must often actively restore and manage our natural areas, which may seem illogical at first, since after all, these are supposed to be natural areas, and you would think we can just let them be and they'll take care of themselves, which in some cases is the case. But because of the transformation and fragmentation of our landscape from agriculture and development, the ecological processes of fire and flooding, large carnivores and large herbivores no longer operate in the ways that they did 200 years ago. And at the same time, as we've disrupted these key ecological processes, non-native invasive species that don't have the checks and balances on them that they did in their native habitats have become increasingly prevalent in our landscape. So in many cases, we utilize different management techniques such as cedar thinning, spot treatment of non-native species, such as Sericea lespedeza on our prairies, implementing prescribed burning, trying to restore hydrology and flooding where we can, maintaining deer populations in check because we don't have wide-ranging carnivores at the levels that keep deer population in check. A lot of these tools need to be used in our natural areas, ironically, to keep them more natural in terms of maintaining their native species in today's landscape. So finally, we arrive at the confluence of the Missouri where it joins the Mississippi. And of course, downstream, there are many different natural areas on the Mississippi Valley corridor, both on the Missouri side and the Illinois side. It would be a great explanation or exploration to talk about for some other time. Of course, the best way to learn about our natural areas is, of course, to visit them. And so for more information on our natural areas and how to access these places, what to expect, just Google Missouri natural areas, and that'll take you to the Missouri Department of Conservation's natural areas web directory. And from there, there's a Google map of Missouri with locations. You can check on those, or you can search by county. And then you can click on different natural areas like Pawnee Prairie shown here, and it'll give you information on what to expect to see, what are the highlights of the area. You can download a topographic map. It'll have information on how to access the site, whether it's open to hunting or fishing or not, what public uses are available. In addition, you could also purchase for $11 the Discover Missouri Natural Areas Guidebook that we put out. You can buy these at conservation department offices, nature centers, as well as our online nature shop. And it's another thing that you can bring with you in your vehicle and kind of explore some of the best areas. And we're going to be reprinting and revising it. And the new edition will hopefully come out in summer of 2021 for this publication. Of course, many great photographers helped me with this presentation that I used their photos from. And with that, let's see here. I think we'll switch to the questions.
All right. Well, Mike, at this point, there's, I think, just a few questions. Not actually seeing the chat right now, so I'll keep looking for that. But super duper great questions. Mark Fingerhut was wondering, prior to agriculture, what were the main sources of phosphorus and nitrate?
Yeah, and that's a good question. They would have been really limited. I'm trying to think any papers that I've read that put a number to that. One of the sources would have been when you do burn native vegetation, you do release some nitrogen and phosphorus into the atmosphere and in the actual the ash itself, and so that would have run off and created some nitrogen and phosphorus itself from burning both lightning fires and Native American set fires. And then just the decay of native vegetation too. And then, there were larger herds of elk and buffalo, not the same scale as we have cattle on the landscape and other livestock today, but that, their dung would have, there would have been runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus from them. But, it would have been on orders of magnitude smaller than today's industrial agriculture. And Little Bean Marsh does dry up. In 2012 was the last time it actually dried up, when we had that very severe drought, and it has in the past. And actually, that's kind of a natural cycle for the marsh. When it dries up, that drying action in the soil allows for certain plant species to move in. Now, during a prolonged drought period, if you were to have a drought of many years, what would happen to Little Bean Marsh is eventually it would succeed to willows and cottonwood trees, because we did notice in 2012 a huge flush of cottonwood seedlings and willows. And you think about like blue holes along the river that kind of ebb and flow. You'll see a ring of tree seedlings around the edges of those where they've drawn down. And same thing for Little Bean Marsh.
Great. So there's a few more questions. Jillian was wondering, would you say that prescribed burns are better than spot treating invasive species? Or are they incomparable? Is one better for certain species?
It depends. I mean, in general, for these systems like prairies and savannas and woodlands, the prescribed burning is preferred. Unfortunately, for some species, in particular, Sericea lespedeza, it's just as fire tolerant as our native species. So we often have to do both, do prescribed burning and then do spot treatment with herbicides. But, fire is a preferred approach for our, it's kind of like the first line of processes that we'd want to use to restore an area.
Yeah, so Dave Galat was wondering what it would take in land acquisition and water management to reconnect Little Bean Marsh or Cooley Lake or some of those oxbow lakes to reconnect them to the Missouri River. And is that even possible in today's environment in any of these places?
Yeah, I would love that. In fact, I mean, about 10 years ago, we were working with the U.S. Geologic Survey. We did some preliminary analyses of just the science behind reconnecting Little Bean Marsh to either the Missouri River floodplain, or the Missouri River, I should say, and or Sugar Creek. And so we've got some baseline information there. But yeah, right now, it would take quite a bit of land acquisition and infrastructure development to do it. However, both at Cooley and Little Bean Marsh, I mean, both of those are, we have management plans and restoration plans to at least think about doing that. But yeah, it won't happen anytime soon, unfortunately.
Right. Jack is wondering if there's any new natural areas in the works.
Yeah, well, our most recent designation was a natural area. Yes and no. New natural areas, natural areas are they're being acquired or restored. So we have new natural area, ironically, of all places, at St. Joe State Park, which is more well known for its lead mining history and ORV use. But interestingly enough, the southwestern corner of St. Joe, there's about 2,000 acres of that 8,000 acre park that has been restored with the thinning and fire for the last 30 years off the bike trail there. That is just an outstanding collection of neat shortleaf pine and post oak woodlands. So that's the latest one. And it's pretty easy to get to it because the bike trail runs along the edge of the whole natural area. In addition, we are also the conservation department. This is exciting. Basically, what was it? 4 years ago, purchased a new addition to Rocky Creek Conservation Area in Shannon County. And this will include, that purchase at that time includes the watershed of Allen Branch, which feeds into the Jacks Fork River. And so we got Allen Branch Cave, which is both a cave and a cave spring. And then this really neat cave spring feeds Allen Branch Creek, and then it dumps into the Jacks Fork, and it's got all sorts of neat fen wetlands with all sorts of really interesting rare plants and animals. And so that'll be designated this coming spring when the survey work is complete. That's probably our most exciting new natural area that we've been able to work on here recently.
Oh, awesome, Mike. I think that's all the questions that I've seen in the chat and the Q&A. Another one just popped up, actually. Steve was wondering, with increased development and population and the spread of invasives, what is your prognosis for maintaining the Missouri Natural Areas program into the future?
It really depends on community type and the place you are in the state. So, if you're a natural area such as Siegel Mountain Natural Area down in the lower Ozarks, it's going to have a higher chance of maintaining its ecological integrity, over the next 100 years versus, say, a Little Bean Marsh, which is probably more threatened because of its surrounding by row crop agriculture and or development. So it depends on the natural areas itself. Some are going to be more viable into the long run future, and others are going to be less viable or will take a lot of energy, human energy to maintain.
All right. Well, Mary Kate did want to pass along, thank you so much for this lovely presentation. I'm looking forward to exploring some of the natural areas that you talked about. Oh, she also was wondering, is phosphorus and nitrate detrimental to the marshes that it's collecting in?
There's a pretty good capacity for those marshes to absorb uh, quite, larger amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, at some point, yeah, there is a tipping point. I have to do my homework to see where that is, but they can absorb and process quite a bit of that. But like anything, there will be a point where there will be too much nitrogen and phosphorus for those systems to handle. I do see a question about Wetland Spring and the Wetland Spring remediation project. So, yeah, the Wetland Spring north of where the natural area is, up on the ridge top to the north, was the Wetland Spring project, where they produced ammunition during World War II, and then it also phased into producing components of nuclear weapons during the Cold War. And that part of Weldon is quite I forget how many miles it is, but it was not impacted, and actually those forests were never cut over. And they probably were actually, they were cut over some, but then when the Army acquired Weldon Spring, they also acquired the land that became the natural area, and that probably prevented them from actually becoming impacted later on. But all the ammunition production and the nuclear work was done quite a distance away, so it didn't impact the natural area itself.
Well, Amy is also asking, what is your favorite natural area?
Oh gosh,
there's
a lot.
Hardest question ever.
I think Caney Mountain might be one of my favorite natural areas, but I can't. Yeah, each community has its own. Prairies, have their own appreciation, and it's really hard to
Yeah, we're actually all pretty jealous that you get to visit all these just like pristine examples of what Missouri can be.
Yeah, more people just need to get out and visit these places, because they really, they're there to enjoy.
Right. Christy is saying, thank you all. Really enjoyed the presentation, photos, maps, and discussion, and looks forward to kayaking the Big Muddy past some of these places next year. So,
right.
Me too. I'm down with that. Cool. I think that's all the questions we have so far. They could still pop up. But Mike, like one thing that this was an amazing presentation. You just covered, well, pun intended, so much ground today, and really highlighting these really unique places that speak to the story of the Missouri River, which is really a great way to look at it. You do an awesome job of bringing the research that has been done by the Department of Conservation, universities, USGS into the story and telling the story of these places. And I just want to point out to everyone that one of the projects that you do every year is the Natural Areas newsletter, which you can find on the Department of Conservation website. You can Google for it. The presentation link on the Big Muddy Speakers Series webpage will have a link to it too. But every year you guys put out one volume per year, I believe. But there's always this great collection of research and stories about these places. Like what's happening next, the exciting stories you have coming up. So definitely want people to check that out. And thank you so much for sharing so much time and all of your deep knowledge about these different places. It was really enjoyable. We really appreciate it, Mike.
Oh, well, thanks for having me, and for everybody joining us tonight.
Awesome. Well, we'll see you out in the trail or on the river, Mike.
Sounds good.
Everybody get out to your local public lands. And if you're lucky enough, check out one of the natural areas across the state and get a little window into the past. All right, we'll see you guys out there.